Welcome back, and we're ready to start again where we left off. No need to diddle around, let's just get going. We talked last time at the end about the Boston Massacre, which was probably the most serious event in several years of riots and demonstrations and so forth. For the first and only time, people got killed. 5 of the demonstrators got killed, 3 who died immediately, 2 who died a couple of days later. And this is really tragic because, as I think I mentioned last time, the riots were protesting against the Townshend duties, which in fact Parliament had repealed a few days earlier or a week or so earlier, but the news had simply not arrived in America yet. So the whole thing was kind of an exercise in futility. It was a very sad thing that people were out demonstrating, and they were demonstrating against something that had already been removed. Now, however, we have to add, Parliament still does not want to be seen as backing down. Parliament is going to still insist that they do have the right to tax Americans. That's what this is all about. Does Parliament have that authority or not? And the Americans have been saying, no, it doesn't, because only their assemblies can tax them. And Parliament insists that they do have the right. So, all right, they're going to repeal the Townshend duties, but they want to still keep the idea that they have the right to do that. When they repealed the Stamp Act 5 years earlier, 4 years earlier, whatever it was, 3 years earlier, well, I can't do the math. When they had repealed the Stamp Act, they had on the same day passed the Declaratory Act to declare that they still had the right to tax Americans. What they did this time was to remove the tax on 4 items, paint, lead, glass, and paper, but they kept it in place on tea. Now, the tax on tea, though, was more symbolic than real because, as I think I mentioned, Americans didn't import tea anyway. If they had imported tea, they would have been buying it from the British East India Company, the company headquartered in London, like local companies were, that had a charter that gave it the monopoly of trade with Asia, and the tea was all coming from Asia. I think I told you the modern day nation of Sri Lanka was where I think that most of the English tea plantations were located, in Asia. But Americans smuggled tea. They got their tea from the Dutch, who also had plantations in Asia, and were importing it through the Dutch West Indies down in the Caribbean, where we had a lot of illegal trade, a lot of smuggling went on. So we were just getting that smuggled tea. So the tax on tea really didn't amount to anything because we didn't import any tea. So it's not actually raising any money, but it's a symbol of Parliament's authority to tax, and that's what they want. And they're content with just a symbolic thing. By 1770, Parliament has sort of given up on trying to get revenue from the Americans. The original reason, remember, had been because of the fear of continued Indian warfare, of Indian attacks on Western settlements. Well, in fact, there are no Western settlements because of the Proclamation Line, and because the Indians simply did not attack settlements that did exist. England has had no problems with Indians. That's what this whole thing started. It was fear of problems with the Indians. Well, there haven't been any problems. And yet England is spending a lot of money to have troops in eastern cities, mainly Boston, but also in New York and Philadelphia, other cities, to keep the colonists in line to prevent damage from the riots. And the riots are all over the taxes. And so people in Parliament are saying, what's the point of having the tax when it produces a limited revenue? There's so much smuggling, and it produces a limited revenue. And yet we're spending all this money to maintain law and order in the cities. Let's just repeal the tax and forget about the whole thing. We don't need the money. We don't have to have as many troops. We got more troops in the cities to keep law and order than we have out on the western frontier to protect against Indians. So what's the point? So they're perfectly willing to get rid of any monetary measures, but they still insist on the principle that Parliament does have the right, as the sovereign body for jurisdiction in the British Empire, it has the right to tax Americans. But since they're not doing it, there's no violence, there's no riots. The whole uprising that had been going on for several years, after March of 1770, when the law was repealed, there's no more violence. It's a little misleading, though, because it's not like we're back to the good old days. This is not like the way it was before England started taxing and everything like that. There have been some other changes that are still there and are still going to be sources of irritation. I want to mention three things, of which I've already talked about two. I've already mentioned two of them briefly. One of those is the Sugar Act. There's been all of this violence over the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties, but the Sugar Act was still on the books, and it was still sort of ignored because American merchants, businessmen who imported sugar, discovered that they could import legal sugar from the British West Indies, pay the tax on it as required by the Sugar Act. The tax was very small. They could pay that tax and import the sugar, and it was cheaper than to smuggle tea from the foreign West Indies. So people are buying sugar in this country, in America, and they're paying the tax on it, and they're not protesting because it's actually cheaper. So, but the tax is still there. It's something that nobody talks about, nobody worries about, but it's still on the books, and that's an issue. That's something that, what are we going to do about that tax? Another issue that's still ongoing that I had mentioned before was that in the aftermath of the Boston Massacre, some of the radicals in Boston, and the two names I think I gave you were Sam Adams and Paul Revere, they're out there agitating for, and they want an extremist solution. They're the far left of the day. They want independence. Now, they don't have very much support. Hardly anybody agrees with that. The overwhelming majority of Americans are supporting their king. They love their king. They consider themselves loyal subjects of the British Empire because it's the British king and he's the best king in the world, and we're so happy to have him as our king. And there's just an acceptance of that. And so the idea of independence is something for extremists, for far left people, that nobody pays much attention to. But they're out there, and they're agitating, and they're working, and they're organizing, and they're mobilizing, and they're trying to get more support and engage in radical activities. So they're still there, even though they don't amount to much, but that issue is still there. And then the third issue, which has changed things, and it's a source of potential problems, although it hasn't yet. But there's another thing that England is doing that's going to cause agitation and problems. England had always known that smuggling into America was just rampant. I mean, that had been going on for decades. And it was sort of like everybody knew about it and nobody cared. Nobody did anything about it. The people who were responsible for doing something about it, if anybody was going to do anything, were the royal governors. They were in charge. They were responsible for enforcing the law in the colonies, maintaining law and order in the colonies. And most of them knew that smuggling oil was going on. I mean, it wasn't a big secret. It wasn't something that was even considered criminal. It was just considered a normal business activity that people engaged in, and that was fine. The governors couldn't or didn't try to enforce it because, as I told you when we talked about the Molasses Act, which was the law being broken mostly, they first of all don't have an enforcement mechanism. If they set one up, they need to get money, and they depend on the assemblies, and the assemblies are not going to give them any money to crack down on this smuggling. And bottom line, even if somehow they manage to arrest smugglers, they have to take them to court, and they have to give them a trial where the decision on guilt or innocence is going to be made by a jury. And most governors realize pretty obviously they're not going to get any convictions out of an American jury judging American smugglers. So why bother? So nobody did. So the smuggling just went on, and nobody cared, nobody did anything about it. Then during the war, during the 7 Years' War, England was fighting against France and Spain. And France and Spain were two of the major producers of sugar in the West Indies. Their big islands were Haiti for the French and Cuba for the Spanish. But they had other colonies and other islands around the Caribbean where we were getting the sugar. And England was fighting a war against England and France. So they're now our enemies. We're fighting a war against England and France. So did Americans stop smuggling from French and Spanish colonies? Well, no. I mean, patriotism is one thing, but we're talking about money here. We're talking about business. Doesn't matter what the country needs. Business has to go on. We still have to make money. So the smuggling, which had been illegal forever, continued. Now it's not just illegal, it's almost like treason. It's trading with the enemy. You're talking about serious stuff, and it still went on. So England finally looks at this and says, you know, we've got to do something about that smuggling. I mean, that's just, you know, it's okay. I mean, it's one thing if they just smuggle and make some money, and all right, you know, and nobody cares, because the people who might have been hurt by it were the English sugar producers, and they were fine. They made enough money as it was. They were producing all the sugar they could and selling it, so who cares? But England says, we can't just allow this law breaking to go on just blatantly. So they started taking several steps to crack down on the illegal trade in sugar from the non-British West Indies. There's other products, there's other things involved, but it's mostly about the sugar from the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, the Swedish, who knows, colonies in the Caribbean. So they did several things. They first of all established what was called the Board of Customs Commissioners as an enforcement agency responsible for enforcing the navigation laws, all of the trade laws, especially this Molasses Act, which since 1733 has tried to prohibit trade with the British or the non-British West Indies. And that board then is going to be based in Boston so that it's on the scene. Part of the problem with the way that things had been was that ultimately the people who were responsible for enforcing the law was the Board of Trade, which was in London and didn't know what the hell was going on in America. I mean, one of the reasons why England had the whole concept of salutary neglect was that administration of the empire was in the hands of the Board of Trade, and the Board of Trade didn't know what it was doing. And it's in London, and people there don't know what they do, and they don't care, and so it's just there's a sort of nothing coming out of England. That's why the American colonies could have their own local governments, and they could just run things the way they wanted, which they'd been doing forever. But now England established this agency based in Boston. And I might mention then, tie in, one of the reasons why there was so much violence in Boston was because the headquarters of the law enforcement agency responsible for enforcing the laws was right there in Boston. It's in that building in downtown Boston, which is still there today. It's a museum today. There's a picture of it in your textbook of the alleged Boston massacre that took place right outside the offices of the Board of Customs Commissioners. The agents of the Board of Customs Commissioners, who are going to be on the royal salary, the whole commission is going to be paid for by British sums, not by the colonial authorities, not by the assemblies. So the assemblies have no control over it. They usually have the power of the purse over law enforcement, but they don't with regard to this agency, which is in Boston, and its staff is on the royal payroll. And those agents have the right to use something that was kind of rare in law. It's called a writ of assistance, a writ of assistance. It's a legal device like a search warrant. It allows law enforcement to search sites, but not subject to the usual limitations on a search warrant. And I don't want to get into a whole lecture here on the law of search warrants, but most of you know that search warrants are issued by a judge who is in the colonial side, is appointed by the assembly. They're issued by a judge. They specify where the officers can search. They specify what they can search for. And law enforcement can only look for the items that are in the warrant. And they specify a time period. That's what search warrants are. That's the way things had always worked. That's the way British law works throughout the whole British Empire. Writs of assistance are exceptions, which are very rare in the British whole empire and the whole idea of the British law enforcement. They allow officials to search anywhere at any time and for anything. So this is just like an open-ended opportunity to search, to go looking for anything that they want, not subject to the usual rights of British subjects for the idea that to be searched, there has to be a warrant. And people didn't talk about, they didn't use the terms such as non-incrimination or rights to privacy or any of those things that we identify with today with the concept that cops are supposed to have a search warrant. They can't just come in and start looking. Under a writ of assistance, they could. And those are issued by the king, and they are for as long as the king holds office. So the agents of the Board of Customs Commissioners could come into a business, a home, and just start looking. And then the key to this was that if they arrest somebody, they're going to try them in what were called an admiralty court. Now that's a special court, special kind of court that doesn't exist very much. It's not common in the English Empire. It's not common for all British people who think of themselves as having all of these rights. And we thought as British subjects that we had the same rights as all British subjects. And one of the most important one that I mentioned was the right to, I hope you get it, trial by jury. Admiralty courts don't operate the same way as what were called common law courts, the basic common law courts of the British legal system. There are no juries in admiralty courts. So Americans are first of all going to be subject to warrantless searches. They're just going to have the agents of the Board of Customs Commissioners can come in anytime they want, anywhere, and just look for anything. And then they're going to be tried in an admiralty court where they will not have the right, which is a basic right of British subjects everywhere in the British Empire, the right to a trial by jury. And just to make it worse, England established a special admiralty court for America. And when I have a class, I get a kick out of asking the students to guess where that court was established. It's kind of a trick question, because this admiralty court that's going to hear these cases of accused smugglers was located in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which my dad has been to Halifax, Nova Scotia as a tourist. It's a pretty town. And he says it's not at the end of the world, but you can see the end of the world from there. And so we're going to haul these people up to Halifax and put them into a court where they will not have the right to a trial by jury. So Americans see this as a dangerous violation of their rights as British subjects, the rights that they have taken for granted forever as belonging to them. One of the reasons why they consider themselves so fortunate to be British subjects, why they love the British king so much, is because under the British legal system, you have these rights of which trial by jury is sort of the linchpin, is sort of the most obvious one. And it looks like England is trying to take that away. So that's an issue. Now, in fact, they didn't do many cases. There were very few trials held in that admiralty court up in Halifax. So there was not a big issue. And the Board of Customs Commissioners, which was having a hard time, and their agents are getting beaten up, and they're fighting for their survival in Boston. The mobs in Boston are trying to shut their offices down. So they're not an active law enforcement agency. And so there's not a lot going on. But it's on the books, and it makes many Americans very nervous about the possibility that the new English policy is not going to respect the rights that we have always taken for granted as British subjects. So there are these issues, but there's no violence, there's no problem, because there's no taxes, in effect, reality. I mean, there are, but we kind of overlook them. The Sugar Act, well, we just sort of ignore that because we can actually live with it, and it's cheaper, so who cares? And the tax on tea, yeah, it's still there from the Townsend duties days, but we don't import any sugar, any tea anyway, so who cares? And then something happened in England that had nothing to do with anything that we're talking about. I'm always amazed at how much history depends on seemingly minor, insignificant events. And I just speculate what would have happened in America if this whole thing that happened in England had not taken place. As I say, it had nothing to do with America. And yet, it's the event that's going to lead to independence and American nationhood. So it's an extremely important circumstance. It involved the East India Company, which I've mentioned to you, and which I told you had a monopoly of all trade between England and Asia. And it's a very incompetent company. It's a very rich company. It's a big company. It's been around forever. Its stockholders included lots of very prominent people in England. Probably several members of Parliament were major stockholders of this company, as rich guys. One of the things rich guys invest in is big companies, and one of the big companies in England is the East India Company. It had nothing to do with America. They didn't export any of their products to America. If Americans wanted Asian products such as tea, they just smuggled it in from the Dutch. So it's not an issue for America. But it's a company that's really, I mean, it's a mess. They're screwed up. And that's what happens when a company has a monopoly. They don't have to worry about running the business effectively. They just make so much money that they don't even care about how they do it. And frankly, their administration is pretty incompetent. And in 1773, the East India Company just screwed up. I mean, they screwed up a lot of things, but they screwed up in their tea trade. They traded all kinds of Asian products. There's all trade with Asia is in the hands of the company. But tea is just one of the things that they imported from Asia. And in 1773, they screwed up and they imported, because they lost track of how much tea they were bringing in. They lost track of how many ships they had sent off to Asia, how much tea the ships were bringing back. They lost track of this. They screwed up, and they ended up with about twice as much tea as they normally imported. And they normally import a certain amount of tea. There's a certain market for it in England. The consumption of tea is pretty consistent year after year. The company imports as much tea as is normally consumed, and everything works out fine. But in 1773, they've got all this excess tea that they don't know what to do with, because it's way in excess of what the normal consumption of tea in England is. So they've got all this extra tea, and they don't know what to do with it. Now, they could dump it on the market and try to sell it to English consumers, but that would just lower the price tremendously, and they'd lose a ton of money on the deal. So somebody in England got the bright idea, hey, wait a minute, this is tea. How about if we allow the company to sell tea to Americans? They don't normally do that, but let's let the company sell its tea to Americans, and that way they'll get rid of some of this surplus that they've got stashed away in warehouses in England, trying to figure out what they're going to do with it. Take it to America and give the company the right to sell tea through designated middlemen in America that the company will select, and they will deal with those merchants, those middlemen directly, and allow those special favored middlemen to sell to the consumers directly. The tea that Americans normally consumed, which is smuggled in from the Dutch West Indies, goes through all kinds of middlemen. There's a lot of what today would be considered inefficient marketing of the tea through a large number of middlemen in America, all of whom make a profit on the deal. A lot of people are making money from all of this smuggled tea, but it results in the price of tea to the consumer getting substantially increased so that all the middlemen can make a profit too. But what England is going to propose here is that the company, the East India Company, be able to market their tea in what it actually would be a much more efficient way. They would just go directly to designated merchants, and the merchants would immediately sell it to the consumers and shut out all of these middlemen involved in smuggling. It will lower the price of tea so that the consumers will buy it because they can get the tea cheaper. They can get legal tea cheaper from the company than they can get illegal tea from the smugglers. And this will do three good things. England passed then the Tea Act in 1773, and it's sort of a, three for the price of one bargain for England. First of all, it will enable the East India Company to get rid of its surplus, which has been the big problem, and that's what started this whole thing. The whole reason the Tea Act was passed was because the East India Company had a lot of tea that they didn't know what to do with because they'd screwed up. But that way you'll solve the problem for the East India Company. Second, you'll undermine the smugglers. you'll be able to offer cheaper tea to consumers in America who will buy legal tea because it'll be cheaper than the smuggled tea. And that way you can get at the smugglers. And in England, as I said, they're trying to finally get back at these smugglers who've been causing them so many problems and have just been out of control for many years. And the Americans just overlooked that. But now, with the Tea Act, we'll actually put some of these smugglers out of business, or at least cut into their profits, by taking away all this marketing in tea that they make from smuggled tea, which now is nobody's going to want. That's the second. The third is the company is going to be able to sell the tea cheaper, but it will pay the tax from the Townsend duties. The one tax is there, since now there's going to be imports of tea, so that tax will be collected. But even with the tax, the tea, the legal tea, is going to be cheaper. But Americans are going to be buying cheap tea, and it will include the tax, which has been on the books since 1767, when the Townsend Acts were first passed. That's been 6 years ago. It's been on the books, but it's never amounted to anything. Now it will. Now Americans are going to be paying that tax. And what they will be doing, at least what Parliament hopes, is that by buying the tea, by paying the tax, they will be admitting that Parliament has the right to tax them. Now this actually isn't going to make any money. It's kind of complicated, but the way it's going to work, the company has already paid the tax, and so there's in fact they're not going to get any money back, and the tax has already been paid, so it's not going to produce any additional revenue for England. It's not going to produce any. It's not going to affect the company because they've already paid the tax. Parliament's not going to get. England is not going to get any additional money because they've already got it from the company. If they just tell the company to go to throw away the tea, they still will have the tax revenue because it's already been paid. So it's not going to produce any money for Parliament, for the Royal Treasury. But it will be getting the Americans to accept the concept that Britain can tax them, that Parliament can tax them. So this is not about money. This is about the concept that England, Parliament, can tax Americans. And the key to it is that the tea will be cheaper, so Americans will be happy to buy it, and by buying it, acknowledging that Parliament can tax them. And once that acknowledgement is in place, then Parliament can go back and get some more taxes, and who knows, I mean, we'll deal with that when we get to it. We'll cross that bridge in due time, but once we get the concept, then we can start thinking about, now, how much taxes do we want to impose on the Americans, and let's see how much we really want and how much we're going to get and so forth. But we'll deal with that. But the idea is the Americans can no longer claim all this stuff about taxation without representation. If they do, we'll just say, yeah, but you paid the tax on tea. You paid that Townsend duty on tea. What are you complaining about? So this is a plan. Like a lot of plans that Parliament came up with, it didn't work. There were several things wrong with the plan. First of all, it's going to cut out the middlemen. That's one of its purposes, is to cut out the middlemen who are smugglers. But a lot of those are the normal, regular businessmen in their communities, and if they are not themselves involved in smuggling tea, they know people who are, their friends, their associates, their colleagues. Many of them are tea smugglers, along with other businesses that they engage in. They do all sorts of other kinds of trade. But these are the people in the town. These are the people who are important businessmen in town. Many of them are very key in their assemblies. I mean, this is you're talking here about the basic business class of America. And that's who you're going to try to screw over. And then, even though the tax is not very big, And even though it's actually going to lead to cheaper tea, American consumers, by and large, still insisted on no taxation without representation. And they saw this sort of, which it was, they saw it as a trick to kind of get around that idea and sort of fool them into paying a tax that they still consider unconstitutional. Under the British Constitution, only their assemblies can tax them. Only their assemblies represent them. Parliament cannot tax them. The Townsend duty on tea is invalid. So in fact, none of the tea actually made it into the home of an American consumer. The East India Company contracted with a number of merchants in American cities, including, let's get to where we're going, you all know where we're headed with this. And in Boston, they actually had a couple of different merchants in Boston that they contracted with to serve as their middlemen. And they did this in other cities, and they had like a dozen or so different merchants throughout the colonies where they're going to have them as their middlemen to import the tea and start marketing it. But none of the tea actually got into the market. It's a little bit complicated, and every place is a little bit different. In some cities, the captain of the ship that was carrying the tea from England to wherever it was in America looked around and saw that there's mobs waiting for him in America, and rather than try to unload the tea and possibly destroy his boat, he turned around and went back to England. And to hell with it, it's not worth it to try to unload this cargo of tea and make the money from the East India Company. In other places, the tea got unloaded. It was taken off the boat, and it was given to a merchant in town, but the merchant who's going to receive it and supposedly going to start selling it realized that if he does, that the mob is going to destroy his store, his business, and who knows what else. So there were a couple places where the local merchants who were supposed to be receiving this, just what they did was they took it, but they stashed it somewhere in a warehouse and locked it up and didn't let anybody know where it was, so that because they figured if the mob finds out that tea is out there, they're going to come out and destroy my warehouse and maybe me, who knows. So it didn't get sold. The biggest issue, as you know, was in Boston. And Boston was kind of complicated because the captain of the ship wanted to unload the tea and get it off his boat so he could go back to England, and that he would get a fee from the company for delivering the tea. And so he wants to unload it, but the merchants who are supposed to receive it don't want it, because they figure if that tea gets into their warehouse or where, the mob is going to come out and destroy them. So there's a standoff in Boston where the merchant keeps saying, take your tea and take it back to England. And the captain says, no, I contracted to deliver it, I'm going to deliver it. Here it is, take it. And they just sort of go round and round. And there's a law in Boston that ships are only allowed to stay in the port for, I think it was like 3 weeks. And then they have to sail. They can't just stay there indefinitely. The port has to have space made for new ships and stuff like that. So there's rules about regulating the port of Boston. And the ship is about ready to run out of time. So this resolution between the merchants and the ship, it has to be resolved. The captain and the merchants have to find out how to deal with this, or who knows, because the ship, it's got to sail either with or without the tea. So there's got to be some resolution of this. Well, as you know, on the night of December 16th, 1773, a mob of Bostonians, largely organized by Sam Adams, including just some of the local mob guys that he could count on to recruit to engage in violence, and then working with some of the local merchants who were the smugglers that were going to be put out of business if the law goes into effect. They went aboard the ship and they dumped the tea. And you all know that that's the Boston Tea Party. And I get a kick out of people in this country today who call themselves, advocates of the Tea Party. The Tea Party involved the destruction of private property. Here Americans talk about, property rights and taxation without representation is a violation of their property rights. But they're out there destroying the property of an English corporation engaged in a lawful business activity. Well, at this point, Parliament decided no more Mr. Nice Guy. The Americans, we passed the Stamp Act. Americans didn't like that. They rioted, so we repealed it. Then we passed the Townsend duties. The Americans rioted. They didn't like it, so we repealed it. We left the one on tea. But we repealed it and we put the whole thing behind us. But now they've gone too far. Now the mob has, as I said, destroyed private property. Destroyed the property of an English company, and I think there are numbers, maybe in your book, I don't even have them in my head, about what the modern value of that cargo was. It's like over $1 million worth of tea got destroyed that night by the mob. So England decided, we're not going to take this. So Parliament passed a series of 4 laws. It's kind of complicated. These are called the Coercive Acts. The Coercive Acts. They dealt only with Massachusetts and Boston. And the bottom line of these acts, they're called the Coercive Acts. They're the Force Acts. They're trying to punish Boston and Massachusetts for the Tea Party. They only applied to Massachusetts. Now, none of the tea had gotten sold. I mean, there's been riots or threats of riots in every city. No place in America did any of that tea actually get sold. Nowhere did the East India Company actually able to follow through on its plan to unload its surplus tea to the American market. But only in Boston had the tea been destroyed. So Parliament singles out Boston and passed these coercive acts. And there are 4 of them. And I don't want to take the time to go into all 4. Let me just focus on what was probably for Americans the most important, the most serious. I mean, among other things, they closed down the Port of Boston. They shut down the Port of Boston, which, Boston is a commercial port and it depends on trade, it depends on the shipping industry. A lot of Boston citizens made living as longshoremen and so forth, and a lot of merchants, do business by trade coming in through the Port of Boston. So shutting down the Port of Boston is a very serious economic blow to the fate of the city of Boston. And that's a serious matter. And there are other serious issues. But because of the time I have, I'm just going to focus on what I think was the most important one, and that the one that people in Boston complained about the most. And it's a complicated piece of legislation. It's has all kinds of provisions. It's called the Government of Massachusetts Act. That's a sort of a condensation of the name. But bottom line, it shut down local government in Boston. It made meetings of the assembly illegal. And it affected other levels of local government, towns and counties and other jurisdictions throughout the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And I've stressed how Americans had always felt we have these rights as British subjects. One of the main rights that we have is that we own property. Large numbers of us own property. We own land, which gives us the right to vote, and we get to vote and elect our representatives so that we have our own government. We govern ourselves. That's what it is. That's what it means to be a British subject in America, is that you have local government. You govern yourselves. Very few people in the world have that kind of power. And we took it as one of the advantages, one of the reasons why we were so happy to be British subjects and why we were so proud of being British subjects is because we have this local self-government. We govern ourselves. And we do it because most of us get to vote. And as always, I hope you know by now that you've got to know who we are. And the we are is white males. So okay, that's who it is. But that's who's doing it. That's who's talking, and that's who's running the show. White males. But they have this local government. And England has taken it away. Parliament has canceled local self-government in Massachusetts. And the intent, I think, was probably to make an example of Massachusetts and to sort of give them a message and give the other colonies a message. You guys better start restoring law and order in your colony, because we're only going to make an issue of Boston. We're going to make an example of Boston and Massachusetts because that's where it was the worst. But nowhere was there law and order. Nowhere did the East India Company get to conduct its business the way it's supposed to do. It's a legal English company. It's engaged in a legal trade, selling tea. It's a perfectly legal activity, and they couldn't do it because of the threat of violence, the threat of mob reprisals. So every colony has been out of control. We're going to make an example and sort of show you that if you don't shape up and restore law and order in your colony, we're going to do the same thing to you that we're doing to Massachusetts. That was sort of the idea. Well, it sort of backfired. Instead of getting the other colonies to say, oh, we don't want to be like Massachusetts, we'll behave, we're going to start cracking down, we're going to start enforcing the law and everything, and we're going to maintain law and order, don't punish us. What happened instead was the other colonies decided to support Massachusetts. They're going to have another Congress, which you remember is a word that means just a meeting. It's just people to get together, and this Congress is going to consist as the first one, the so-called Stamp Act Congress. It's going to consist of delegates elected by the assemblies. It's going to be the same thing as the other Congress. Each of the assemblies is going to send delegates to the Congress to meet. This is going to meet in Philadelphia. The Stamp Act Congress met in New York. They're going to call it the Continental Congress because it's representing the colonies from the continent of North America as opposed to the colonies in the Caribbean. Remember, England has all those colonies down in the Caribbean, but they're not part of it. And of course, their whole situation is very different. They don't have assemblies. They don't have the same whole issue that we do in the continental colonies. So this is the Continental Congress, and we're going to meet, and we're going to act to defend our rights. And then, as it happened, Parliament also passed another law that actually had nothing to do with this. That's the whole, another issue just off the wall, had nothing to do with these matters. Parliament has figured out that they are not having problems with the Indians as they had expected. And so they decide we can now restore English government to that territory in the West that has been set aside as an Indian reservation, an Indian reserve, ever since 1763 in the Proclamation Line. That whole line area in the West has been basically under Indian jurisdiction. But Parliament has said, well, we can give that territory, at least in the Northwest, just the part of it, sort of the northern half of the West. And it's then, if you look at a map, it's the area between the Ohio River, the Appalachian Mountains, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi River. In that northwestern territory, we're going to let one of the colonies, one of our colonies, can now have jurisdiction. It'll be part of their land. We're going to give one of our colonies all of that land. Now this is going to be troublesome, because in fact there were like 4 different colonies claimed parts of that land in the Northwest. Virginia claimed it all. And then New York claimed a little chunk of it. Massachusetts claimed a little strip that ran across it. Connecticut claimed a little strip that ran across it. So, there'd be a question of who would have jurisdiction. But the obvious answer was Virginia, because Virginia claims all of that land. And remember, as I told you, there are people in Virginia who have their eyes on that land. And they figure, I know somebody in the assembly who's going to be my buddy, or maybe it's assembly members themselves, or it's one of my sort of political associates that is going to give me the right to a block of land out there in the Northwest. And if and when the New Orleans problems get solved, I hope you realize that, remember all the previous lectures, when that New Orleans problem gets solved, then I'm going to be able to start selling that land, and I'm going to make a ton of money, and woohoo for me. And Parliament gave that entire land to the colony of Quebec. As I said, I like to have it in class because I get a kick out of asking students which colony got it, and who ever heard of the colony of Quebec? It's only been an English colony since 1763. It's the colony that England set up for the French people that it acquired because they won the war, and so what was now Canada went from French to English jurisdiction, and so to administer it, England gave it all to the colony of Quebec. I mean, they set up this colony of Quebec for the French-speaking people, and now they've given that colony, out of all the colonies in British colonies in North America, the one that got all of this valuable land in the Northwest, is now given to Quebec. So the Quebec Act is very, very troublesome. Several reasons. First of all, it's the fact that it should have been Virginia, and people in Virginia are very bitter that it's not them. They are not going to be able to get their hands on that land. Second, Quebec, by British law, is a Catholic colony. The people who lived in the colony of Quebec, or at least in the old part of it, up around the modern-day city of Montreal, the people who lived there were French. They were Catholic. And England, when they took them over, I mean, they've got all of these people that are now British subjects, but who are French in origin. And to appease them and to try to be good guys to them, they had established the Catholic Church for them, which was fine with them. That's what they wanted. But in parts of America, there's still a lot of anti-Catholic prejudice, especially in New England with its roots in the Puritans. The New England colonies were strongly Puritan, still strongly anti-Catholic. So there's a lot of bitterness about giving all that land to, of all places, a Catholic colony. But probably the most significant was that the colony of Quebec did not have an assembly. The French colonies had never had assemblies. The French administration for their empire, they never gave local government, and the French didn't do things the way the British did, and they had never had assemblies. So the people of Quebec, the French-speaking people, had never had an assembly. It's not an issue for them. They don't have an assembly as British subjects. They don't have an assembly like the other continental colonies, but they don't care. They don't even know what an assembly is, so it's not an issue for them. But many Anglo-Americans saw this as a threat to their assembly. So they think, even though the Quebec Act was passed by England without regard to the Tea Party or anything like that, it's because they just think, well, you know, we've had the proclamation line in effect for whatever it's been. I can't do the math in my head, but ever since 1763, and it's not been a problem. The Indians are not a problem. So let's restore white jurisdiction over this land in the Northwest, and let's give it to Quebec because it's part of what had been the French Empire. That whole valley had been part of the French Empire, so it's just the logical thing to give it Quebec. But Americans said, they're after our assemblies. This comes at the same time as the Coercive Act, including the Government of Massachusetts Act, which suspends the assembly in Massachusetts. And then of all the colonies that they could have given this to, they gave it to Quebec, the one British colony in North America that doesn't have an assembly. They're out after our assemblies. So Americans linked the Quebec Act to the Coercive Acts, and they called them together the Intolerable Acts. The Intolerable Acts. And so the Continental Congress is going to meet in Philadelphia in the summer of 1774 and devise a response to the Intolerable Acts. And that's where we'll start next week, or in next class. I can't get out of the in-person use. Now, a question that you should answer in your brief essays, to answer with regard to the lecture, is what was England trying to accomplish by passing the Tea Act?